The air over southern England on the night of June 5, 1944, was alive with vibration. Hundreds of engines beat against the darkness, carrying the first wave of men who would begin the liberation of Europe. In the dim interior of a C-47 Skytrain, the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division sat in silence, their faces streaked with charcoal, their eyes fixed on the red light above the jump door. They had trained for this moment for more than a year, yet no amount of drills could still the tremor that comes when history approaches. Each man carried 80 pounds of equipment: rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, rope, and the essentials of survival. Among them was Private First Class James Howell, a 23-year-old from rural Kentucky whose quiet steadiness had earned him the nickname Preacher. Howell was not a preacher in the literal sense, though he had once studied for it. His voice carried the slow assurance of someone raised on hymns and hard labor. He was a radio operator by training, but tonight his mission was simpler and infinitely more dangerous: to drop behind enemy lines, find the causeway roads leading from Utah Beach, and help secure them against German counterattack. If the paratroopers failed, the seaborne troops who would land at dawn could be trapped between the Atlantic and the flooded Norman fields. The jumpmaster shouted above the roar of the engines. 10 minutes. Harnesses were checked, weapons secured. Howell felt the weight of his M1 carbine at his chest, and the small comfort of a steel canteen bumping against his thigh. It was a battered thing, dented from countless drills, the only piece of gear he truly trusted. In its screw-off cup he kept a small hunting knife, a personal addition, allowed by no regulation but tolerated by sergeants who knew better than to argue with superstition. As the plane approached the French coast, flak began to burst outside, brief orange flowers against the night. The C-47 shook violently, the red light flicked to green, and men began to disappear into the wind. Howell stepped into the door, felt the cold slap of air on his face, and leapt. For a few heartbeats there was only blackness and the scream of air past his ears. Then his parachute opened with a crack, jerking him upright. Far below, the fields of Normandy glimmered with the pale reflections of moonlight on water. The Germans had flooded the lowlands, turning meadows into marshes. Tracers laced the sky, and other parachutes bloomed like ghostly flowers around him. Some drifted into the dark water and vanished. Others snagged on trees or power lines. The drop zones were chaos. Howell hit the ground hard, sinking knee-deep into mud. He wrenched free of his harness, pulled his carbine from its case, and crouched low. Around him came shouts, gunfire, and the clatter of distant vehicles. His compass needle quivered uselessly. The iron in the wet soil confused it. He was alone, somewhere west of St. Mir-Église. The nearest objective, the La Fère Bridge over the Murderette River, was supposed to be a mile away. He started walking. The night smelled of peat, smoke, and salt. Every few yards he stopped to listen. Once he heard the muffled cries of another paratrooper caught in a tree, but the risk of giving away his position kept him moving. He reached a hedgerow and paused to drink from his canteen. The water was warm and tasted of metal, but it steadied his nerves. He had no radio, lost in the landing, and only a vague sense of direction. Still, training had taught him that confusion was temporary. The mission remained. Secure the roads, block the German armor, hold until relieved. Near dawn he heard the faint rumble of engines to the east, the sound of vehicles moving fast on a raised causeway. Through the gaps in the hedgerow, he could see the outline of a narrow bridge spanning the flooded fields. German half-tracks and trucks were parked along it, their crews smoking and talking quietly. The bridge was small, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, but it was the key to the entire sector. If the enemy held it, reinforcements from Corentin could strike the beachhead before noon. The bridge had to be destroyed or captured. Howell counted 7 men and a light machine gun. He had 5 rounds in his carbine and no grenades, lost in the drop. He watched the scene for several minutes, thinking. In his hand he felt the smooth curve of his canteen, heavy with water. Then an idea came, simple, desperate, and plausible only because no other option remained. He unscrewed the cap and poured half the water onto the ground, leaving just enough to slosh audibly when shaken. From his pocket he took a small amount of carbine grease and rubbed it around the threads, creating a tight seal. Then he placed the canteen on the road a few yards ahead, tilted slightly. To a sentry's eye, it might look like something dropped by a passing soldier. He waited until one of the Germans noticed the glint of metal in the growing light. The sentry stepped forward cautiously, rifle in hand. He kicked the canteen. It rolled and made a faint metallic click. Curious, he bent to pick it up. As he did, Howell moved, one step, then another, until he was inside the range he trusted most. He threw the knife. The blade struck with a dull sound, and the man crumpled silently into the grass. Before the others could react, Howell snatched the canteen, now smeared with grease and mud, and lobbed it toward the parked half-track. It struck the vehicle's side and clattered down into the wheel well. The startled crew jumped down, searching for what they thought was a grenade. The brief confusion gave Howell the opening he needed. He fired twice, hitting the machine gunner and the driver who had reached for a weapon. Then he ran, not backward but forward, closing the distance as the remaining Germans dove for cover. He reached the bridge rail, slammed the muzzle of his carbine against a wooden crate, and felt it give way. Inside were charges, field explosives, likely for demolition. He grabbed 2, pulled the pins with trembling fingers, and dropped them beneath the half-track before diving into the water below. The explosion tore through the dawn, shattering the calm. When he surfaced, pieces of debris rained into the flooded meadow. By the time he crawled onto the far bank, coughing and soaked, the bridge was impassable, its decking splintered, vehicles burning. Smoke rose in a black column visible for miles. Minutes later, he heard the crackle of small arms fire and the shouts of approaching Americans. A scattered platoon of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment emerged from the hedgerows, weapons ready. Their lieutenant stared at the burning bridge, then at Howell, who stood dripping and covered in mud, still clutching his empty canteen. "What the hell happened here?" the officer asked. Howell looked back at the wreckage. "Bridge won't be used by anyone for a while," he said simply. It was the understatement of the morning. The destruction of that crossing forced a German battalion to reroute its armor hours later, delaying their counterattack long enough for the beachhead at Utah to solidify. The after-action reports would never mention the details. They would only note that enemy forces failed to deploy armor via the Murderette Causeway due to local sabotage. But among the men of the 507th, the story spread quickly, of a lone paratrooper who had blocked the bridge with nothing more than a canteen, a knife, and nerve. When the sun rose fully, the fields of Normandy shimmered with water and smoke. Howell sat against a hedgerow, cleaning his carbine. He refilled the canteen from a nearby ditch, screwed the cap tight, and slid the knife back beneath it. He did not know, and would not know for weeks, that his improvised act had altered the rhythm of an invasion. To him, it had been a simple choice made in a dark hour. But history, indifferent to modesty, would later find it significant. The morning of June 6th broke grey and wet over the Cotentin Peninsula. Fog clung low to the hedgerows, muffling sound and smell alike. To the men scattered across Normandy, it seemed the entire landscape was trembling with the distant thunder of ships' guns firing from the sea. Private First Class James Howell sat in a ditch with 7 other paratroopers of the 507th, his uniform still soaked from the river. They had spent the last 2 hours consolidating what little ammunition they had, orienting themselves on their maps, and trying to make sense of the chaos. None of their watches matched. Their radios were lost or waterlogged. Yet they knew one thing for certain. The bridge that had once carried German vehicles toward Utah Beach was gone. At 0600 hours, the first columns of American infantry were already wading ashore. The destroyers offshore pounded German positions with relentless rhythm. But for all their might, the beach landings were fragile. Every success depended on the paratroopers inland. They were the thin, scattered line holding back armored counterattacks until the bulk of the invasion force could establish itself. Howell's small group now sat directly in the path of that potential counterstrike. A lieutenant named Wilkins took command of the cluster of men who had survived the night's drop. He was young, barely 25, but his voice carried calm authority. "We hold this line," he said. "The Krauts will try to cross somewhere else, maybe upstream. We make them pay for every inch." There were nods all around. They dug in along the embankment, setting up overlapping fields of fire with what ammunition they had left. Howell checked his carbine and then the knife still sheathed under his canteen. Both were clean, functional, and oddly comforting. By mid-morning, the sound of engines echoed again from the east. Through binoculars, Wilkins saw movement, trucks and infantry columns moving cautiously along the flooded causeway. The destroyed bridge had forced them to improvise. A few vehicles were attempting to cross using wooden planks and makeshift rafts. "They're testing us," Wilkins muttered. He turned to Howell. "You did that." Howell nodded once. The officer exhaled. "Hell of a job, son. Bought us time." The Germans began probing forward, sending squads along the raised road. The Americans held their fire until they were within range, then unleashed a short, controlled burst. The enemy fell back quickly, wary of the ambush. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Howell crouched lower in his ditch, mud up to his elbows, eyes scanning the hedgerows for movement. The smell of cordite mixed with wet earth, a scent that would define Normandy for months to come. As the day lengthened, the paratroopers' isolation became evident. They were cut off, surrounded by flooded fields and enemy patrols. A few local French farmers risked their lives to bring information and bread, whispering about German troops regrouping in the nearby village of Coquigny. If the enemy captured the small stone causeway bridge there, they could still strike toward St. Miraglisse. Wilkins decided to send 2 men, Howell among them, to scout the area. They moved at dusk, slipping along the flooded edges of the Murderette. The water was cold and dark, filled with floating branches and the silent bodies of paratroopers who hadn't made it. Howell pushed through with quiet determination, his senses sharp. In the fading light, he saw the outline of Coquigny, a church steeple, a few stone houses, and a small stone bridge guarded by Germans. Through his field glasses, he counted at least a dozen soldiers and an armored car. Too many for a frontal assault. "How far from our line?" whispered the corporal beside him. "Maybe a mile," Howell replied. "But they're building up. Tomorrow they'll try to cross." They withdrew to report. Wilkins listened, nodding grimly. "We'll need to hit them before dawn," he decided. "If they get armor across that causeway, the whole sector collapses." That night, Howell could not sleep. The memory of the first bridge still burned in his mind. The explosion, the fire, the chaos he had caused with nothing but a canteen and courage. It had worked once. Could he repeat it? He turned the battered canteen in his hands, feeling the dents along its side. The metal had become a kind of talisman. It had saved him once in Sicily when it stopped a stray bullet, and now it had become his signature weapon. He wiped the mud off it carefully, checked the seal, and waited for orders. At 0300 hours, under a thin veil of mist, Wilkins led a group of 9 men toward Coquigny. They carried rifles, grenades, and determination, but little else. Howell took point, guiding them through hedgerows until the faint glimmer of the German positions appeared ahead. The armored car was still parked near the bridge, its engine idling intermittently. The sentries looked half asleep. Timing would be everything. Wilkins whispered, "If we can disable that car, we can block the bridge." Howell, ideas. Howell looked down at the canteen in his hand, then at the narrow stone arch of the bridge. "Give me a distraction," he said. "2 men fire on the far side in 3 minutes. I'll handle the car." Wilkins studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Do it." Howell slipped away into the darkness. He crawled along the ditch beside the road, the damp smell of moss filling his nose. The water sloshed softly against his knees. Ahead, the armored car loomed, its crew visible in silhouette against the faint glow of their own cigarettes. He unscrewed the canteen cap, emptied it completely, and slid the knife inside. The handle protruded just enough to catch light. He tightened the cap and waited. When the first shots cracked from the American rifles on the far bank, the German guards instinctively turned toward the sound. Howell rose from the ditch and hurled the canteen with all his strength. It spun through the air and struck the armored car's open hatch with a metallic clang before falling inside. To the startled crew, it sounded unmistakably like a grenade. They shouted in panic, diving out of the vehicle. Howell was already moving, sprinting forward as the men scrambled clear. He reached the car, yanked the hatch open, and pulled the knife free from the canteen's mouth. In a single motion, he drove it into the vehicle's exposed fuel line, twisting hard until the metal split and gasoline poured out. Then he kicked a flare into the stream and dove for cover. The explosion ripped across the causeway, lighting the sky in brilliant orange. The armored car went up in flames, blocking the bridge just as the Germans turned their guns toward the commotion. Wilkins' squad opened fire, their tracers cutting through the smoke. Within minutes, the entire enemy detachment was either dead or retreating toward the village. The Americans held their ground, stunned by the violence of their own success. When the firing stopped, the bridge burned like a torch, impassable. Wilkins found Howell crouched behind a stone wall, his face smeared with soot but uninjured. "You and that damn canteen," the lieutenant said, half in disbelief. "You've done it again." Howell shrugged, breathing heavily. "Just seemed like the thing to do." The lieutenant laughed softly. "Remind me never to play poker with you." By sunrise, the second bridge was gone, and the German counterattack in the Murderette sector had been completely blunted. Hours later, when tanks from the beaches finally pushed inland, they found the paratroopers exhausted but alive, guarding the smoldering wreck. The story of the man with the canteen spread quickly through the ranks. Each retelling added new details, some true, some invented, but the core remained. A single paratrooper, out of ammunition and options, had used his wits and a bit of luck to save hundreds. Howell never considered himself a hero. In his after-action report, he wrote only, "Used standard equipment in unconventional way to disable enemy vehicle and prevent crossing." The officers above him expanded that into a citation for gallantry. Within weeks, he was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. He accepted it with embarrassment, insisting that any man would have done the same. But those who had been there knew better. That night, as he finally rested in a captured farmhouse, Howell sat by a broken window and looked at the stars above Normandy. The canteen, blackened by fire, rested beside him. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip of water. It tasted faintly of smoke and metal, the flavor of survival. He smiled to himself, a tired smile that belonged to soldiers who had seen too much and still somehow endured. Outside, the guns of the invasion thundered on, but for the first time, The tide of war had begun to turn in the Allies' favor. And somewhere between the flooded fields and the burning bridges of the Murderette, a small piece of steel and a well-timed idea had quietly rewritten the course of D-Day. The days that followed D-Day were a haze of exhaustion, mud, and movement. The paratroopers who had survived the night drops were now the thin spearhead of the Allied push inland, scattered groups of men fighting as if the entire war depended on each hedgerow. The air smelled of cordite and wet grass. The sound of gunfire never truly stopped. Private First Class James Howell walked at the rear of a small column of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, his boots caked in the clay of Normandy, his canteen hanging from his belt like a talisman. By June 8th, the beachheads at Utah and Omaha were connected. Columns of tanks and supply trucks crawled inland along roads the airborne had cleared at enormous cost. The countryside, those dense, green walls of hedgerow, turned every mile into a skirmish. The enemy fought stubbornly, retreating only when firepower made resistance impossible. The paratroopers moved cautiously, taking nothing for granted. They had learned that the hedges hid everything: ambushes, snipers, mines, or sometimes only frightened French farmers clutching rosaries. Howell's company was ordered toward Canteen, a critical crossroads town that connected the Utah and Omaha sectors. The Germans knew its importance, and were already digging in along the approaches. The road to Canteen passed through a narrow embankment lined with poplar trees and drainage ditches. It was the kind of terrain that swallowed men whole. As Howell trudged forward, the weight of days without sleep pressed against him. His mind replayed the images of the burning bridges behind them, the chaos, the explosions, the faces of the men who hadn't made it. He had stopped thinking of himself as brave. Survival had become an act of endurance. That evening, the unit bivouacked in a ruined orchard outside the village of Angovillo Plain. A medic from the 501st, a man named Kenneth Moore, tended to the wounded in a small stone church nearby. Howell helped carry stretchers, his hands steady but his thoughts distant. Inside the church, pews had been turned into makeshift operating tables. The smell of blood mixed with candle wax and iodine. The medics worked silently, focused and relentless. Howell watched them for a moment and then stepped outside, the evening air thick with smoke from burning fields. A sergeant approached, crouched beside him, and handed him a folded map. Orders came down. We move again at 0200. Canteen by morning. Word is the Krauts are pulling in reinforcements from the south. He paused, glancing at the canteen hanging from Howell's belt. You keeping that thing lucky? Howell gave a faint smile. So far, it's kept me one step ahead of trouble. The sergeant nodded. Then keep it close. We might need another miracle. They moved out before dawn. The column advanced through a narrow road flanked by deep drainage ditches. The night was quiet except for the rustle of boots and the click of gear. Then, without warning, the darkness erupted. Machine guns opened from both sides. Tracer rounds whipped through the air. Men dove for cover, some vanishing into the ditches. Howell hit the ground, mud splattering his face, his ears ringing. The Germans had set a perfect ambush. The first few minutes were chaos. Orders shouted, then drowned out by gunfire. The column splintered into small groups, each fighting for survival. Howell crawled along the ditch, looking for a vantage point. A burning truck illuminated the road, casting long shadows. He saw movement ahead, 2 Germans setting up a machine gun behind a fallen tree. He reached for his carbine but found the chamber clogged with mud. He tried to clear it, but the weapon jammed. He was defenseless. Instinctively, he reached for his canteen. The dented metal felt cool and solid in his hand. It wasn't a weapon, but it had become his constant companion, the object that had seen him through every desperate moment. Then his fingers brushed the handle of the knife tucked beneath it. His pulse steadied. He crawled forward, staying low, his body pressed to the wet earth. The Germans were so focused on firing down the road that they never saw him slip behind the wreckage. He rose silently, closing the last few feet in a rush. The knife struck first, quick, efficient. The second man turned too late, and Howell drove him back into the ditch. The machine gun lay abandoned, its barrel steaming. Howell grabbed the weapon, swung it around, and opened fire down the road, cutting through the German position in a storm of tracers. The sudden burst broke the ambush. American voices shouted above the din, rallying, pushing forward. Within minutes, the road was theirs again. When the smoke cleared, the lieutenant found him kneeling beside the captured gun, his uniform spattered with mud and blood. "That was you?" he asked. Howell nodded, wiping his hands on his trousers. "They were setting up the gun. I just got there first." The lieutenant shook his head. "You just saved half the column. That's 3 times now, Howell. You ever think of running out of luck?" Howell smiled faintly. "Not if I can help it." They pressed on, reaching the outskirts of Canteen by nightfall. The town was a ruin of shattered buildings and cratered streets, defended by German paratroopers as determined as the Americans. For 2 days, the battle raged from house to house. Howell fought with the same calm precision that had carried him through the drops, the rivers, the ambushes. His legend grew quietly, whispered among the men, the paratrooper with the canteen who kept turning the impossible around. On June 12th, the final assault began. Artillery leveled the German positions on the far edge of town, and the paratroopers advanced through smoke and rubble. Howell moved with a squad, clearing the last line of resistance near the train station. They found themselves pinned down by a German sniper in the clock tower. Every attempt to move was met with a precise shot. Ammunition ran low. The men ducked behind a stone wall, cursing the unseen enemy. Howell looked up at the tower. The sniper had the perfect angle, but his focus was entirely forward. Howell studied the structure, the side alley, the broken ladder leading up to a lower roof. He knew what he had to do. Without a word, he slipped away, moving through the shadows until he reached the building's rear entrance. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed, each step deliberate. He could hear the faint click of the sniper reloading above him. When he reached the top, he pulled the knife from its sheath once more. The canteen swung lightly at his side. He stepped out onto the narrow platform just as the sniper turned. The 2 men froze for a fraction of a second, eyes locked. Then Howell lunged. The struggle was brief, brutal, silent. The rifle clattered to the floor. The sniper fell, and Howell stood alone in the tower, breathing hard. He looked out over Canteen. Smoke drifted through the streets, but the gunfire was fading. Down below, American troops were advancing freely for the first time. The sniper's death had broken the last defense. The town was theirs. When Howell descended, the men greeted him with disbelief. "You got him?" someone asked. He nodded, handing the captured rifle to the lieutenant. "He won't be bothering anyone again." The lieutenant looked at him, then at the canteen swinging from his belt. "You're writing your own manual out here, Howell. Maybe one day they'll teach it." But Howell only shook his head. "You can't teach luck," he said quietly, "or desperation." That night, the paratroopers slept in the ruins of Canteen, too tired to celebrate. For the first time since the jump, Howell allowed himself to think beyond the next hour. The invasion had succeeded. The beachheads were secure. The bridges he had destroyed and the roads he had defended had played their part in the vast machinery of victory. Yet he felt no triumph, only the dull ache of survival. He pulled the canteen from his belt, unscrewed the lid, and drank deeply. The water was cold, clean, and silent. He turned the metal over in his hands, tracing the scars along its surface. It had been dented by bullets, scorched by fire, and still it endured. In its reflection, he saw his own face, older now, lined with fatigue. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Guess we both made it." Outside, the rain began again, washing the smoke from the air. Normandy slept under the rhythm of its own salvation, and in the quiet corner of a ruined town, one paratrooper sat with a canteen and a knife, the simplest tools in a story that had changed the course of a war. The Normandy campaign moved eastward with relentless momentum. By late June, the beaches were a humming machine of logistics, tanks rolling ashore, fuel lines snaking inland, and endless streams of men marching toward the front. But for the airborne divisions, the battle was far from over. They had paid for every hedge and every bridge with blood. Their reward was to keep moving. James Howell marched with what remained of his company along the Bocage lanes south of Canteen. The countryside was quiet now, deceptively so. The Germans had fallen back, but their rearguards were still active, ambushing patrols and harassing supply lines. Every ruined farmhouse hid uncertainty. Every field could conceal a machine gun. The paratroopers walked with their rifles ready, and their nerves stretched thin. It had been almost 3 weeks since the jump. The uniform that had been olive green was now stained brown with mud, sweat, and gunpowder. Howell's boots were held together with parachute cord. His canteen, dented, blackened, and scarred, was still clipped to his belt. It rattled softly when he walked, the sound familiar and grounding. The knife stayed tucked in its makeshift sheath beneath it. Together they had become symbols of survival. Soldiers in nearby platoons recognized him not by face, but by the rhythmic tap of that canteen. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were now tasked with pushing toward St. Lo, sealing off escape routes and linking up with armored divisions. It was a job of persistence rather than glory. The big, dramatic moments of D-Day were past. Now came the grinding days of attrition. And yet, in that monotony, stories still emerged. Small flashes of ingenuity and defiance that shaped the war's rhythm in invisible ways. One afternoon, while advancing through a wooded ridge, Howell's platoon came under sniper fire from a farmhouse overlooking the road. A single rifle shot echoed, and a young private fell where he stood. The men dove for cover, but the sniper's position was well chosen, elevated, hidden, commanding the entire approach. Returning fire only revealed their own positions. The lieutenant hesitated, scanning the trees, knowing any movement could be fatal. Howell lay flat behind a stone, watching the flash from the farmhouse window each time the rifle spoke. He measured the rhythm, 6 seconds between shots. That meant the sniper was working alone, carefully reloading after each round. He studied the ground, saw the drainage ditch running parallel to the road, and made a decision. Without a word, he slid into the ditch and began to crawl. Mud filled his sleeves, his knees scraped against stones, but he kept moving. The sound of gunfire masked his progress. When he reached the base of the farmhouse wall, he could hear the faint creak of the sniper's boots above. The back door was locked from the inside, but the hinges were old, rusted. Howell pulled the knife from his belt and worked it carefully between the wood and metal, prying until the screw gave way with a faint squeal. He froze, waiting. No reaction. Slowly he slipped through the narrow gap into the kitchen. The air smelled of smoke and fear. He moved silently up the staircase, pausing after each step. The sniper's rifle cracked again, the sound painfully close. Howell crept forward until he saw the glint of the weapon barrel through the half-open attic door. The sniper, intent on his next shot, never saw the shadow behind him. The knife flashed once, and it was done. The silence that followed was immense. Howell stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, then picked up the enemy rifle, a Mauser 98K fitted with a long optical sight. Through the lens he could see his own men waiting below, their faces tight with anticipation. He gave a small signal with his hand. The danger was over. When he rejoined the platoon, the lieutenant looked at him with disbelief. "How the hell did you?" Howell shrugged, wiping the blade clean. "Just followed the sound," he said. From that day on, his reputation solidified into something close to myth. Soldiers began to whisper that Howell had an instinct for survival, that he could sense danger before it appeared. They called him the Canteen Ghost, the man who turned up where things went wrong and somehow made them right. He hated the name but accepted it with quiet amusement. The truth, he believed, was simpler. He was alive because others had not been, and that was a debt he could never repay. By early July, the Allied breakout from Normandy was underway. Operation Cobra tore open the German front, and the road to Paris began to open. Howell's company, reduced to half its original strength, was pulled back for rest near Saint-Miraglisse, the same village he had drifted over on D-Day. The church steeple still bore the torn parachute of a soldier who had hung there during the drop. Civilians returned from hiding, bringing bread and cider to the weary Americans. For the first time in weeks, the men smiled. One evening, sitting on a wooden crate outside a barn, Howell cleaned his knife while watching the sunset. The lieutenant joined him, carrying 2 tin cups and a bottle of apple brandy. "To Corentin," the officer said, pouring, "and to that canteen of yours. You realize they're talking about you back at division headquarters? There's a rumor Eisenhower himself heard the story." Howell shook his head, laughing softly. "I doubt the Supreme Commander cares about one muddy paratrooper." "You'd be surprised," the lieutenant replied. "Command likes stories that keep the boys believing." He raised his cup. "To belief, then." They drank in silence for a moment, watching the horizon. The sun sank behind the hedgerows, casting long shadows across the fields. In the distance, artillery flashed like summer lightning. The war would move on, to Paris, to Holland, to the frozen hell of the Ardennes, but in that moment Normandy felt eternal. Howell leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, the canteen resting in his lap. Its surface caught the last red light of dusk, glowing faintly like an ember. Later that night, when the camp grew quiet, he took out a small notebook and began to write. It was not a diary in the usual sense, no mention of fear or loss, no complaints about the mud or the endless marching. He simply recorded what he had seen, the bridges, the explosions, the faces of the men beside him. At the end he added a single line: "Sometimes the smallest thing you carry turns out to be the one that saves you." Weeks later, when the company shipped back to England for refitting, Howell packed the notebook with his gear. The canteen went with him, cleaned and polished but never replaced. It had become a symbol of improvisation, of survival, of the fine line between chaos and control. When a reporter from Stars and Stripes asked him about the D-Day story, he tried to deflect. "I just did what I had to do," he said. But the journalist pressed, and eventually Howell showed him the canteen, the knife still nestled beneath the cup. The photo appeared a week later under the headline, "The Paratrooper Who Fought with a Canteen." From there, the story spread, half truth, half legend. Some said he had single-handedly blown up 3 bridges. Others swore he'd faced down a tank armed with nothing but a knife. Howell never corrected them. He knew how stories worked in wartime. They gave meaning to madness, direction to fear. If his name helped another man hold the line, that was enough. When the war finally ended, Howell returned to Kentucky. He farmed, married, raised children. The canteen hung on a nail above his workbench, a relic no one quite understood. Sometimes, when visitors asked, he would take it down, turn it over in his hands, and say only, "This old thing got me home." Then he would smile and change the subject. Years later, long after he was gone, his family donated it to the 82nd Airborne Museum at Fort Bragg. The tag beneath the display reads, "Standard issue canteen and field knife used by PFC James Howell, 507th Per, 82nd Airborne Division. Credited with actions contributing to the defense of the Murderette bridges during the Normandy invasion, June 1944. Visitors still stop to look at it, puzzled that such an ordinary object could carry so much weight. But those who have known battle understand. They see in that battered metal the essence of survival, the moment when courage, invention, and necessity become one. And somewhere in the quiet halls of the museum, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint echo of an idea born in the darkness of D-Day, that even the simplest tools, in the hands of one determined soul, can change the course of history. By the 1960s, Normandy had become peaceful again, its hedgerows grown over, its beaches echoing with laughter instead of gunfire. The villages once shelled and burned were rebuilt with whitewashed walls and new church bells. Every June, tourists and veterans returned, walking the same roads where war had once moved like a storm. And somewhere among them, in the crowds of old soldiers and curious children, James Howell walked quietly, a weathered man in a simple jacket, anonymous except for the small airborne patch stitched on the sleeve. He had returned once before, in 1954, on the 10th anniversary of D-Day. The Army had invited surviving veterans to attend a ceremony at St. Miraglisse, where the first American paratroopers had touched French soil. Howell went reluctantly, unsure how to face a land that had once swallowed so many of his friends. But when he arrived, the town was filled with flags, flowers, and the laughter of children born after the war. The church that had once been scarred by bullets now displayed a stained glass window depicting paratroopers descending from the sky. It showed them as angels, not soldiers. During the ceremony, an interpreter led Howell and a few other veterans to the fields near the Murderette. The bridges had been rebuilt, their wood replaced with steel, the water below still and green. A French farmer pointed to one of them and said, "C'est là, ici, the Americans stopped them." The man's son, no older than 10, stood beside him holding a small American flag. Howell nodded, his throat too tight for words. He thought of the canteen, the knife, the blast that had turned the night sky orange. He wondered if the farmer knew how close his village had come to destruction. When the ceremony ended, Howell slipped away from the crowd and walked alone along the riverbank. The smell of grass and water was the same as it had been in 1944. He sat down on the embankment, took the canteen from his satchel, and poured a little water into the river. It wasn't sentimentality. It was acknowledgement, a quiet conversation with the ghosts who still lived there. Then he stood, slung the canteen back on his belt, and walked toward the town square where the veterans were gathering for lunch. He said nothing to anyone about what he had done. For the next 20 years, Howell lived the life of a quiet craftsman. He ran a small workshop repairing farm machinery, never missing a day's work. He taught his children how to sharpen tools and mend fences, the same way he had once repaired rifles and radios. To his neighbors he was simply Jim, a steady man with calm eyes who spoke little of the past. Only once did he mention the war, when his eldest son asked him if he had been afraid during the jump. Howell thought for a moment and said, "Yes, but fear's just the wind in your face. You lean into it, or it blows you backward." In 1969, a historian researching the airborne operations tracked him down through military archives. The researcher, a former paratrooper himself, had found scattered references to an unnamed soldier who had disabled German armor on the Murderette Causeway by unconventional means. He suspected Howell was that man. Howell agreed to an interview, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the same canteen resting beside it. The historian asked him to describe the night of the jump. Howell spoke slowly, methodically, as if replaying a machine in his mind. He described the confusion, the noise, the bridge, the half-track, and the explosion. When the historian asked what he had been thinking at that moment, Howell smiled faintly. "That I didn't want to die in the mud," he said. "That's all. You act because not acting is worse." The historian wrote later that Howell's matter-of-fact tone was more powerful than any drama. There was no trace of pride in his voice, he noted, only the clear logic of a man who had made a decision and accepted its consequences. The article, published a year later, was titled "One Canteen, One Bridge, One Night in Normandy." It sparked brief attention among military readers, but never reached the public imagination. Howell preferred it that way. In the 1980s, as the generation that had fought the war began to fade, the U.S. Army's Center for Military History launched a project to document individual acts of valor. Howell's name resurfaced through oral histories. Veterans of the 507th spoke of the man with a canteen who had saved the causeway. Cross-referencing action reports, the researchers concluded that his explosion had delayed a German armored counterattack by several hours, long enough for the 4th Infantry Division to consolidate its beachhead. In tactical terms, it was small. In strategic terms, it had preserved an entire flank of the invasion. Howell received letters from the project team asking for photographs, records, anything he might have kept. He sent them a brief note in reply. "The story belongs to everyone who was there. Not just me." He never attended another ceremony. When journalists called before the 40th anniversary of D-Day, he politely declined interviews. "Let the young men speak," he said. "We've had our say." And yet, his name continued to appear in books and documentaries, each time a little more embellished. Some accounts claimed he had single-handedly destroyed a convoy. Others credited him with saving an entire regiment. Howell's family learned to recognize the patterns of myth-making. "Dad's legend grew every year," his daughter once said with a laugh. But the real story was quieter and truer. He passed away in 1988, just shy of his 67th birthday. His funeral was small, attended by family, neighbors, and a handful of veterans in faded uniforms. The honor guard folded the flag, the bugle played, and a single paratrooper placed his old canteen on the coffin before it was lowered into the earth. The inscription on his stone was simple: James Howell, PFC, 507th PIR, 82nd Airborne Division, 1921 to 1988. He did his part. The decades that followed only deepened his legend. When the 75th anniversary of D-Day arrived in 2019, historians revisited the lesser-known personal stories that had shaped the invasion. Howell's name surfaced again, this time in documentaries and articles focused on ordinary men in extraordinary moments. The photograph from Stars and Stripes, the young paratrooper holding a dented canteen, became a symbol of ingenuity and courage. Museums requested his family's permission to display the original artifact. They agreed on one condition: that it be shown not as a relic of war, but as a reminder of human adaptability. At the ceremony unveiling the exhibit, a retired general spoke to the crowd. "Every victory has 1,000 fathers," he said, "but some of them wear no rank and carry no medals. Sometimes they just carry a canteen." The audience fell silent. Behind him, under soft lights, the metal canteen gleamed faintly, its surface etched by time. The accompanying plaque quoted Howell's own words from the 1969 interview: You act because not acting is worse. Visitors lingered before it, trying to imagine the night sky of 1944, the roar of engines, the flash of flak, the moment when one man decided that if nothing else could stop the enemy, perhaps improvisation could. Children asked their parents how someone could save D-Day with a canteen. The parents smiled and said, "He was brave." But the curators knew it was more than bravery. It was the union of fear and invention, the defining human moment when necessity becomes genius. Every June, flowers are laid beneath his display at Fort Bragg and at the small memorial near St. Miraglise. The plaque there, written in French and English, reads simply, "À la mémoire du soldat américain James Howell, whose quick thinking and courage at the murderette helped secure our freedom. He carried no more than a canteen and a knife. It was enough." The story endures because it captures something fundamental about the invasion itself. That D-Day was not only a triumph of strategy or numbers, but a mosaic of individual choices made in darkness. Men like Howell filled the gaps between plans, improvising, surviving, and shaping history through instinct. In every retelling, the tools may change, the weapon, the bridge, the timing, but the essence remains. It is the story of what happens when an ordinary man meets an impossible situation and refuses to freeze. Today, 80 years after the Normandy landings, the fields along the Murderette are peaceful again. Cows graze where paratroopers once fought. The water reflects the clouds instead of fire. Tourists drive across modern bridges, unaware that beneath their wheels lies the ghost of one that never reopened. And somewhere, in the soft wind that rustles the hedgerows, one might almost hear the faint metallic rattle of a canteen swinging against a paratrooper's hip, a reminder of the night when courage came not from what a man carried, but from what he dared to do with it.